Here's a really simple test you can do right now to test how well your hips are able to rotate. And by looking at how your hips function and what your entire body has to do to make that happen, you can start to get a bigger picture as to why you might be having problems with movement and balance and maybe pain as well. So our hips are ball and socket joints that are designed for high levels of movement. They should be able to fully rotate and twist and flex and extend. So sitting at a desk and squatting down, bending forward, going up and down steps are just few examples of our everyday lives of how we ask our hips to perform their normal functions of flexing, extending and rotating. So let's take a look at how your hips are able to move, and then I'll explain what you might have found when you did this test. For the single leg hip rotation, we're asking our hip to do a very simple movement, but it might not feel simple. This is a closed chain position, so notice how my pelvis is on the ground, my upper body is still, my feet are on the wall, and there's really not a lot of ways I can wiggle out of this position. So when I ask my right ankle to be brought to my left knee, I'm testing here, can my right hip flex and can it externally rotate? I'm trying to understand if that function can happen here. Now, this will happen when the hip can function really well, when the hip can flex and externally rotate without a problem. So my pelvis doesn't have to move around at all to help me out. If my hand is on my pelvis, it stays exactly in place. So this means that my hip can nicely rotate within the socket in my pelvis without my pelvis having to move to help it out. Now, if my hip can't rotate well, what will likely happen is I'm going to lift my pelvis off the ground, twist it to the side, and yes, I get the rotation at the hip doing that, but it's not true hip rotation. It's me twisting my lumbar spine, shifting my pelvis out to the side. So my left pelvis has moved and it's now closer to my ribs than my right pelvis. So this is one way that I can cheat to get the movement I want. It looks like my right hip is rotating out, but it's not really. If I were to put my pelvis back into alignment, that hip can barely rotate. So the goal of this test here is we're looking at whether the hips can flex and externally rotate without any restriction and without anything else having to twist or change position to get that movement to happen. So what happened when you did this test? Now, here's a couple of scenarios. The first thing is that you couldn't get your ankle to the opposite knee because that hip doesn't move so well. So when you tried, maybe you felt too tight or stiff, it was quite immobile, and perhaps you needed your hand to help pull that leg into position. Now, if that's the case, then it strongly suggests that there's some dysfunction present in your hip. When you asked your hip to function, it didn't work. Now, this usually happens at the end of months or years where you've gone without asking that tissue, the muscles, the tendons, the nerves and the ligaments, without asking them to continually function and do their job, their normal function. So those cells will eventually lose the ability to work. If you don't use it, you lose it. And when asked to function, they simply aren't able to. Now, dysfunction can be reversed, but it will take some time for your physiology to be able to do this again, because it most likely took considerable time for this problem to build. And this is how I help people in the Pain-Free Movement program. Now, the second scenario is that you could get your ankle to your opposite knee, but maybe you had to lift or twist or rotate or basically move your pelvis, your spine to be able to do that. Now, that's a perfectly clear example where compensation was occurring. So if you can't externally rotate your hip without lifting up your lumbar spine, your lower back, and twisting it, then that lower back has learned that it needs to move whenever the hip needs to externally rotate. There's this kind of torque going on, this twisting torque in your lower back every time you ask your hip to move, because your hip can't function as a hip. The lower back is starting to help out. Now, if this is happening just in this test without motion, then what's happening when you walk, when you run, when you sit, when you do any kind of sports or activities? So this test is a really brilliant way to understand back pain, because if every time you try to move your hip, you have to do that by flexing your pelvis back and lifting it up and rounding the lower back, then think of what happens every time you take a step, every time you sit, every time you stand, you're asking your back to help out every time you're asking your hip to flex or rotate. So here, if that's what's happening without motion, then for sure this is going to be happening when you go into your every life, when you're walking or running. So maybe this might start to now make sense as to why you might be having back pain and why treatments focusing just on your back have not helped you. So it's also really important to understand that nothing works in isolation within your body. So, and you've just learned that. So when you asked your hip to rotate, a lot of other body parts had to move to help that happen. So it's not just isolated to your hip. It's not a hip problem because your entire body has to move and compensate for this dysfunction every time you ask your hip to move. When your hip just can't be a hip, you have to pull in other joints and motions just to get the job done. So if you want to change this problem, then you have to understand, go back to basics, that hips don't just work by themselves. There's a lot of muscles, more than 58 or so muscles that connect your hips to your pelvis and your spine. So if your hip is showing signs of compensation or dysfunction, then it will absolutely be impacting problems around your entire body because of how there's all these muscles that are connected to your hip, the pelvis and the spine. If the hip can't work properly, it's going to have a ripple effect throughout the body. So it's not really a question of if this problem is affecting your ankles, your knees, your hips, your pelvis and your spine and your shoulders. It's actually a question of how it's affecting your entire body. If that right hip, let's say, cannot externally rotate and it's bringing in the lower back that has to move, then how is that affecting your entire body's capability to move and function because it's had to compensate and reorganize itself around this hip that's not able to do its job properly? So to restore this, it's going to require a full body solution, and this is why I specialize in teaching people these full body corrective exercise sequences, because you can't just change this by zooming in on the hip. You have to take a step back and work on the entire body as a whole to fully restore this problem. So every time you've asked your hips to move for years and years, maybe decades, your entire body has picked up the slack and learnt how to help you out. So all these quirky movement patterns that your body's put in place throughout the body need to be relaxed and tamed, re-educated as we restore function to your hip. So it's always a whole body approach to restore function to your entire body so we can restore proper movement patterns and functions. And if you want to find out how to make changes to how you're feeling and moving, then check out the Pain-Free Movement program in the description below this video. If you like this video, subscribe for new videos every week.